I'm Roberta Greenstein, member of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual presentation today, Jewish Life in Argentina, with Dr. Adriana Brodsky of St. Mary's College. This program continues our series about global Jewish life, and please consider joining us the same time next week for In Conversation, Understanding Jewish Turkey, as we talk with a group of individuals from the Turkish Jewish community about both the history of this community and life in Turkey today. Then the following week, on Thursday, August 19th at 7 p.m., we welcome Marjorie Augustin for her presentation, Memories of Jewish Chile. At the close of the program, we will share links to register for both of these events. Dr. Brodsky has joined us for several superb presentations over the years at the JMM, although today is the first time we are welcoming her to our virtual JMM programming. Dr. Brodsky is professor of Latin American and Jewish history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Her book, Sephardi, Jewish, Argentine, Creating Community and National Identity, 1880 to 1960, appeared in 2016 with Indiana University Press. She is published on Sephardi food, schools, beauty contests, and Latin American Jewish history in general. Currently, she is finishing a manuscript on Argentine youth in Zionist movements from the 1940s to the 1970s. She is co-president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. Dr. Brodsky, please take us to Argentina. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So here we are. So thank you very much to the Jewish Museum of Maryland for your invitation again and for this wonderful introduction. It's really good to be back here. I wanted to just very briefly describe what I will be discussing today. We have a very short amount of time, and so I will be touching on some of the things that I thought might be interesting. So the first thing that I will talk about is why Argentina. So why is it the Jews would have wanted to come to Argentina, and then why Argentina would have been interested in receiving Jews. The second thing that I will describe, the topic that I will talk about, is Jewish Gauchos, the existence of these cowboys, Jewish cowboys working the land in Argentina, and the role that that played, both in the imaginary as well as in the concrete ways that it supported the presence of Jews in Argentina. I will also describe the urban immigration, so the areas where Jews settled in towns and cities elsewhere. Last but not least, I will describe a little bit about who these Jews that came to Argentina they were, and a little bit about the Jewish life that they created in this country. And I am a historian, so I tend to actually look really to the past, but I will end with a very brief discussion of some of the current issues in Argentina. So let me start. The choice made by youth to come to Argentina was similar to those made by many other immigrants. Argentina is actually one of the 6 countries around the world that received the greatest numbers of overseas immigrants at the turn of the century. And although it was a distant second in number of arrivals, it experienced the most dramatic increase in population. The country had only 1.7 million inhabitants in 1869, the end of the civil wars after the creation of the modern nation. But that number increased to more than 20 million by 1959. This is more than a tenfold increase in a period of 90 years. Argentina's experience was also unique in that immigrants came to account for a huge percentage of the population as a whole. In 1914, for example, 1/3 of all the inhabitants in Argentina were foreign-born. In the city of Buenos Aires, this figure was close to 60%. So 1914, you would have walked down the streets of Buenos Aires and you were most likely to have heard not Spanish, or at least the Spanish from Spain and not the Spanish from Argentina. Large numbers of immigrants chose Argentina in part, and this is Jews and non-Jews, because of immigration policies which were adopted by liberal ruling elites starting in the second half of the 19th century. Argentine authorities sought to attract European immigrants, not only to exploit the rich lands recently made available by the elimination of indigenous people, but also to regenerate, to whiten, and that was a word that was used, the local population. The desire, of course, was to bring in or to attract primarily Northern Europeans, Germans, British, French. Yet most of the immigrants who ended up coming to Argentina came from South and Eastern Europe, as well as from regions in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. And although most of the newcomers were Catholic, Argentina also became home for non-Christian minorities, including Jews and Muslims. The number of Jewish immigrants who settled in Argentina was lower than those of the Italian and Spanish migrants, which were by far the largest ethnic groups who arrived. Yet the Jewish community they built became with time the largest in Latin America. How many, you ask? Very hard question. It's a very difficult question to respond given a variety of factors. But this chart, I think, will give you a sense. In 1914, Jews accounted for 1.49% of foreign-born inhabitants in the city of Buenos Aires, not in the rest of the country. And that 1.5% of Jews living in the city of Buenos Aires compared to 20% in the same census of the city for Italians and almost 20% for Spaniards. So you see how wide the difference was between Jews and then these larger ethnic groups. By 1930, the Jewish population, including Argentine-born Jews, was around 200,000. And by 1960, close to 300,000 of the nation's 20 million inhabitants were Jews. So Argentine immigration policies oscillated between a desire to foster agricultural production specifically by facilitating a move to the interior provinces and by making land accessible to newcomers, either for purchase or for in a system of tenancy, and a more general need to address a shortage of labor in urban areas. In the countryside, the native worker, usually referred to as a gaucho, and here we have a picture that pretty much depicts these native workers, had to compete then with immigrants who were coming and in huge numbers and who had more support from national and provincial government agencies. Liberals' belief in the improvement of Argentina through a regeneration of its Spanish, indigenous, Black population made it hard for these gauchos, who were usually mestizos, a combination of indigenous and Spanish and Black ancestors, to survive this new reality brought about by the presence of immigrants in such huge numbers. So as gauchos were struggling and losing against these immigrants who were coming in hordes and supported by the government in going into the countryside, their symbolic weight grew. Especially in the last decades of the 19th and in the first few of the 20th century, urban writers and intellectuals contributed to turning the gaucho into an icon of Argentine national identity. The gaucho characters in iconic literary works, such as José Hernández's epic poem Martín Fierro, and the novel Don Segundo Sombra by Ricardo Guiraldes, among others, highlighted the qualities this icon came to have: loyalty, bravery, intelligence in a way of just being smart, hard work, and self-reliance. And within this discursive imaginary, immigrants found in the gaucho an ideal to emulate in order to facilitate their inclusion into the nation. There were Jewish gauchos, and they did play a central role in the construction of Jewish identity in Argentina precisely because of the ways in which it matched the ideology of the time. How did these gauchos come to be? So while on the one hand, we have an Argentine government who's wishing to regenerate the population and encourage its agro-export economic model, at the same time, as I said, Baron Maurice the Hirsch founded in Paris the Jewish Colonization Association in order to fund agricultural colonies that could provide persecuted and destitute Eastern European Jews with a livelihood. He, through his association, purchased large tracts of land in Poland, and I marked here on this map, where I'm talking about in Poland. He bought land in Turkey, in Cyprus, and in Palestine, but most of his investment was done in the Americas. There were agricultural colonies in Canada, in the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, in the United States, in the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. And in South America, the Jewish Colonization Association founded colonies in southern Brazil and in Argentina. But it was in Argentina where the company had its greatest success. In total, the Jewish Colonization Association founded 11 agricultural colonies in the provinces of Buenos Aires, Santa Fe, Santiago del Estero, La Pampa, Entre Rios, and Chaco, which are located in very fertile areas of the country. And I will talk a little bit about what these agricultural colonies looked like, but I just wanted to say that later generations of Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals promoted the image of the Jewish gaucho working the land next to the Argentine campesino to claim that Argentina had indeed been built with the help of Jewish hands, making Jews an inextricable part of the new nation. In 1910, Alberto Gerchunov, who was an Argentine writer and journalist whose family had lived in one of the Jewish Colonization Association colonies, wrote the now very famous book, Gauchos Judíos, the Jewish Gauchos, which came to symbolize Jewish commitment to Argentina and to suggest the path to becoming an Argentine. In fact, the Jewish Colonization Association had clearly stated that their objectives were, and I quote here, to make good Argentine farmers, end of quote, out of the Eastern European Jews who settled in the colonies. So their desire was, right, to take these Jews who were being persecuted in Russia and Eastern Europe, to bring them over to Argentina, to work the land so that they could become accepted as part of the Argentine nation. And so there was an assimilationist desire here. But the colonies themselves also became very Jewish enclaves. In fact, one could argue that they became the most Jewish of Jewish areas in Argentina. And I will discuss that in just a minute. And in an effort to think a little bit about that, I want us to hear this song that I will be playing in a second by composer, Yiddish singer and composer Hevel Katz, who lived in Argentina between the 1930s and the 1940s, and who died tragically in a car accident when he was at the prime of his fame. He was actually so famous that he was called the Jewish Carlos Gardel. The song that I want to play, and that I hope that you can read. As you can see, there are 3 columns here. I have on the left, on the right-hand side, the Yiddish. For those of you who do read Yiddish, in the middle, I have the transliteration of the song. So if you wanted to just sing along, but do not read the Hebrew script, you can just read the transliteration. And then on the last column, I have the translation to Spanish so that you can understand what he's talking about. So he is actually he wrote this song about Moises Viche, who was the most important, perhaps, and the epitome of the Jewish colonies, agricultural colonies in the province of Santa Fe. So I'm going to play it. I'm going to let you enjoy, dance if you want, sing if you want. It's a very catchy tune too.
freilich in a Masel dicke Show, in a Winkel Argentina, Moschiach ist schon da. Dort ist nicht nur kein Christen, nur jeden klein und groß. Der Apotheker und der Beider, der Kommissar und Huis in Moseswil. Mein klein Städtel Moseswil. Mein schön Heimele, bist da jüdische Medine, bist da stolz für Argentina, Moseswil. In mitten Städtel steht a Klasse, Bäumer gar a Pracht, spazieren dort die Ingwer, a jeden auf der Nacht. Man sucht sich buena noches, als du's Chayes geht a Jois, und Tage nicht ein Molaschi, der dreht sich fin de Mois in Moseswil. Mein klein Städtel Moseswil. Mein schön Heimele, bist da jüdische Medine, bist da stolz für Argentina, Moseswil. A Radio spielt dort Tangos fahren Neulen, wo spaziert. Erzählen Weiber meistens, was in Städtel hat passiert. Bei wem es wird sein Knoim, bei wem es sein Abris. Und bei wem es hat sich freitig zugebrennt der Knisch in Moseswil. Mein klein Städtel Moseswil. Mein schön Heimele, bist da jüdische Medine, bist da stolz für Argentina, Moseswil. Auf der Plasse steht ein Mensch, a Pundikel gewiss, mit breitliche Bombatsches, Sapatisches auf die Fies. Du, die Bigotites, pfeift a Spanisch Lied, merkt ihr dort sein sicher, als der Pundik ist a Jid in Moseswil. Mein klein Städtel Moseswil, mein schön Heimele, bist da jüdische Medine, bist da stolz für Argentina, Moseswil. Meine
All right. So as you see, it's such a combination of what to him, Moisésville looked like. It was a place where you could hear tangos on the radio, where everybody was a Jew, and yet everybody also looked like a goy. So this combination of an assimilation that at the same time allowed for the existence of a very clear and visible Jewish identity. And so I want to show some of the photos of these, some of the pictures of the institutions that the colonists, together with the Jewish Colonization Association, founded on these colonies. Groups of families were brought together, and each group of families created a synagogue, of course. They also built schools, Jewish schools, where the Jewish, the children of the colonists could attend, and where in many cases the children of non-Jews who lived as workers on the colony attended as well. Initially, these schools were in the hands of the JCA, of the Jewish Colonization Association, and another philanthropic organization called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was an organization also founded in Paris with the intention of elevating the culture of the Sephardi Jews that lived in the basin, in the Mediterranean basin. And so the Alliance Israélite Universelle actually sent Sephardi Jews to teach, because of their facility with Spanish, as they spoke Ladino in many cases, their ability to actually teach things in Spanish, the national anthem, Spanish as well. And so here we have a photo of one of the schools in the Colonia Wahlberg. There were other institutions that were created that provided, that enabled them to maintain their Jewish identity and to make a living. like the agriculture, the cooperatives that they founded. In fact, an argument has been made that the whole cooperative movement in Argentina, in the countryside, was spurred by the arrival of these Jewish agricultural workers or agriculturalists who had, right, this ability to incorporate these practices. This is the milk companies, cooperative of milk producers. Some of these colonies, one needs to really read to figure out that in many cases, life was hard. In many cases, the children would not wish to remain there and would leave for towns in other parts of Argentina to study, many of whom actually became trained in the liberal professions of doctor, lawyers, and things like that. And so the efficacy or the success of these agricultural colonies, could, if measured in number of people that remained, might not be good. But in one of the things that it also did is that as people left these colonies, they moved to other parts of Argentina, and especially in the towns that were located very close to these colonies, they also just brought a lot of the organizations that allowed them now to live urban Jewish lives. So this is in the city of close in Moisesville, the popular library that was founded during the early years of the 20th century, and then also the theaters, which were centers not just for plays, but also for speakers, political parties, for political rallies, that has now become a sort of a cultural heritage for Argentina. But as I mentioned earlier, if you've heard of these colonies of Jewish gauchos, it was because of the role they played in helping Jews claim their space within the nation. Not because they were the largest group of Jews, by all means, right? And so most of the immigration Jewish immigration to Argentina ended up being urban. And here I just give you some, again, numbers are very hard to be completely sure, 100%. But these numbers give us an idea that the percentage, right, that last column indicates the percentage of Jews who were actually Jewish gauchos. And so whereas at the very beginning, we see that number is very high, right? As we move into the first decades of the 20th century, we see that number decreasing, right? And whereas we start at the very beginning, at the very end of the 19th century, with 60% of the Jews were actually agricultural workers, by the 1930s, that percentage drops to 10%. Most of Jewish immigration, as I mentioned, was urban. And while Buenos Aires was undoubtedly the most chosen city, it was the entry port. Jews did settle in cities and small towns all over Argentina. Another important characteristic of Argentina, of Jewish life in Argentina, is that it also welcomed a significant number of Jews from the Sephardi diaspora, and many Jews from the Middle East, who are now called Mizrahim, but were always called Sephardim in Argentina. These Sephardi groups were a minority within the largest Jewish community, around 20%, but were very visible enough in the past as well as today. And because this is my specialty, I will talk a little bit about the Sephardim in Argentina. And I hope that if you have any questions about Ashkenazim, that you ask me during the Q&A. So these Sephardim came from various places around the world, mostly around the Mediterranean basin. And they tended to organize around their origin. So Moroccan Jews tended to just stay with Moroccan Jews. Syrian Jews tended to stay, and you will see what I mean by that. Moroccan Jews were the first group who arrived. They arrived the earliest, towards the end of the 19th century. And they founded actually the second Sephardi congregation in Buenos Aires. This is a picture of what that synagogue looked like right now. When it started, of course, it did not look like that. This was in the Sud neighborhood, which was very close to the port. And so it makes sense that, you know, a lot of these initial settlements of Jews and other immigrants in general were close to the port. In the city of Buenos Aires, they settled in, as I mentioned, the Sud neighborhood. And I tried to map, and perhaps it's too small for you to see, but I tried to map that whenever I mean they settled, they created their synagogues, their organizations, you know, really within 10 or 20 blocks from each other. And what they also founded was the first cemetery in the province, the first Jewish cemetery in the province of Santa Fe a few years later. An interesting characteristic of the Moroccan immigration to Argentina is that they followed the railroad line as it was built, the railroad line that went towards here. And you can see, right, that sort of the dots mark not just towns, but actually the towns where a lot of the Sephardim from Morocco settled. And they literally were just following the train as the train was founding these new towns. Most of these people were not agricultural workers, but actually merchants. They set up stores along the railroad lines. Arabic-speaking Jews who arrived starting in 1910 arrived from two cities, from the city of Damascus and the city of Aleppo, and they settled in the city of Buenos Aires depending on their city of origin. So here again, right, the fact that they were both Syrian is a category that may make sense to us as being uniting. To them, right, it really mattered which city you came from. So those Jews that came from the city of Damascus settled in specific neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, in the area of Boca and Barracas, in the neighborhood of Flores. And then those Jews, Syrian Jews from Aleppo, settled, right, in the neighborhood of Once, also in the neighborhood of Flores, and then in the neighborhood of Ciudadela, which was outside of the city limits of Buenos Aires. Outside of Buenos Aires, and here I have, outside of the city of Buenos Aires, they of course settled in a lot of other provinces. And in many cases, again, they're following the trains and opening up stores and engaging in the city of Buenos Aires in the textile industry. The Syrian Jews who had also members of families living in Manchester and other areas around the world were able to tap into this particular economic niche. What we see here is I did a little bit of the same of what I did with the previous Moroccan population. You can see that whenever they settled in the area of Bocas and Barracas, they created all their institutions, social, cultural, educational institutions, very close to each other. And I want to show you here in the city of Boca and Barracas, the magnificent synagogue that they built in the 1920s, called Ortora, which is still visible, very Oriental in style. The Ladino-speaking Jews, which was the next group of Sephardim, came mostly from former Ottoman lands after 1919. And most of this immigration was actually either at the end of the Ottoman Empire or once the Ottoman Empire had disintegrated. The communities, people came from Salonika, the city of Salonika, Greek city of Salonika, Rhodes, Balkan countries, and many cities in now present-day Turkey. In the city of Buenos Aires, they mainly settled in the neighborhoods of Villa Crespo, in the neighborhoods of Once, Colegiales, and Villa Urquiza. And in many cases, they would actually they belonged to different cities. Smirli Jews, settled mostly in Flores, and then those that came from other places in also followed each other. In the rest of the country, Ottoman Jews settled in the cities of Tucumán, Rosario, Santa Fe, Posadas, and Córdoba. And again, right, most of these Jews engaged in trade and became merchants. They spoke Ladino, right, which is Judeo-Espanol, this language that was brought, with them, that they brought as they were expelled from Spain in 1492. And it was an asset. It proved to be an asset because it aided in the transition to the new land. It was very easy to understand, even if it sounded a little different from the Spanish that Argentines spoke. It was something that allowed for better communication. The Jews that came from Syria spoke Arabic at home. And a lot of that is an important reason why they also kept very important and strong ties with non-Jewish Syrian groups because of their ability to communicate with each other in Arabic. And then last but not least, there were smaller groups which arrived from Palestine and then from Italy, from Bulgaria, and even from Samarkand. What I have here again, Villa Crespo was a very, very busy Jewish neighborhood. What I've plotted here were some of the addresses that I was able to find in material. And again, the idea is that, a group of people would settle close to each other. They would found the synagogue, the school, the social club, eventually this organization would create a medical, doctor's offices, providing with medical care to the members of their communities. Jewish life. Jewish life, I'm going to talk here not just about the Sephardim, but also just about Ashkenazim. And it was congregational, so it was based, right? The religious centers were important, but they were not the only institutions, right, that sort of grounded and anchored Jews. Given the fact that Argentina had a liberal elite that had been intent on separating church and state, the country was very, very secular overall. And I think that contributed, right, for the importance of other types of institutions outside of just the main religious ones. So Jewish life was, right, centered around both cultural rituals or cultural activities, as well as around religious rituals. Jewish institutions then were not only religious like synagogues, but they were social, cultural, and sporting centers as well. In fact, I would venture to state that Argentine Jewish culture shaped up to be much more secular than the US Jewish culture, especially, right, until the last few decades of the 20th century. In Buenos Aires in particular, Yiddish culture Yiddish culture flourished. There are studies of Polish Jews who scholars have revealed that the ways in which these Jewish intellectuals had mapped Buenos Aires within Polishkeit and Yiddishkeit, right, making Buenos Aires another center, right, in which Yiddish came to be the glue that bound people all over the world. There was a very active Yiddish theater here. That are two posters sort of announcing some productions which welcomed foreign acting troops, right? So if you're familiar with Molly Pecan, who was an American Jewish Yiddish stage actress, traveled to Argentina together with various other famous actors. There were a lot of newspapers in Yiddish, and then eventually in Spanish. There were Yiddish, Spanish newspapers and magazines, as well as a very important and active publishing scene. You have to remember that Night, the famous book by Elie Wiesel, was first published in Buenos Aires in Yiddish before it even appeared in French and in English. The secular Jewish educational institutions were also very important. The particular institutions associated with the politically leftist group, the Jiddischer Kulturverband, was numerous, and they provided education in Yiddish, right? In many cases led by teachers who were sent from Poland to teach Yiddish, because to them, right, Yiddish was what united Jews. Now that Jews in Argentina chose these institutions, which were not free, you have to support these institutions when the state was providing free education for all. Just gives you a sense, right, that people thought that these ideas, either Yiddish or religious practices, right, were something that Jews wanted to pass on to the next generations. And here, just to give you a sense, right, of the variety of Jewish schools that were created within the Sephardic communities, I'm just listing here for you to get a sense of each community of origin, right? The Moroccans, those from the city of Aleppo, the city of Damascus, in different neighborhoods in the city of Buenos Aires, founded their own mostly religious institutions amongst the Sephardim to train mostly young boys for the bar mitzvah and other types of religious activity. But you can see, right, the amount of institutions that we are talking about. The religious schools, right, were meant to provide, as I mentioned, right, Jewish education to prepare young men, but not exclusively, right? And we will see that more and more girls are going to participate as well. And in the 1960s, changes in educational policy allowed for private institutions to teach the state curriculum as well as, right, content that they thought important. And so this was the birth of the full-day Jewish schools, which taught, as I mentioned, both the Argentine public curricula as well as Jewish history. Until this point in time, until the 1960s, kids who wanted some type of Jewish education, whether it be religious or not, had to go after their attendance to regular state schools. The founding of sporting clubs in the 1930s, while many argued was the result of discrimination against Jews, which was not necessarily true, was considered an important step, right, to complete their integration into the country. On the one hand, work and physical labor helped dispel anti-Semitic images, while the development of physical strength also helped to reinforce dignity and bring about modernity. And so in this, Jewish Argentines followed both Jewish and non-Jewish examples of the cult of the body as a sign of strength, as well as a sign of modernity. So here I have some photographs of a publication that a weekly publication that appeared in 1945 at the celebration of the founding of the Club Maccabi, which had taken place in the 1930s. And as you can see, right, the one here on top is talking about the importance of physical defense. This is in the context of the Holocaust, where there was this assumption that Jews had meekly been led to gas chambers. And it is through activities like a sporting club that the Argentine Jews are sort of going against these ideas about the meek Jew, right? And training the body. And so the sporting clubs played an important role in facilitating and in changing some of the existing maybe anti-Semitic stereotypes that existed at the time. But I would like to end with two photographs so that we do have time for questions. The religious Jewish chairman of the real estate company, which converted a major Buenos Aires landmark into the shopping mall that you see here in this picture, decided to add a kosher McDonald's for the observant Jewish population in the area. Located in a Jewish neighborhood with more than 36 synagogues around it, the Abasto Mall, this is the name, became in 1998 the first place outside of Israel to have a branch of the popular hamburger chain serving kosher food. As well, if you were to pay attention, as you walk into the Abasto Mall, there is a mezuzah on the main entrance door, and it also has two regular McDonald's stalls where many customers are directed to when they find out they cannot buy a regular cheeseburger at the kosher counter. Following in this trend, in 2018, a kosher hamburger and sausage stall made its appearance in Boca Juniors soccer stadium. For those of you who don't know, Boca Juniors is the best soccer team in the world. Well, maybe I'm a little particular to that since I've been a fan from when I was 6 months old. Now, while the kosher McDonald's stand could be seen as providing an existing Jewish market, there's about 12 synagogues around the mall. Now, the kosher alternative of the popular hamburger chain, right, does not seem to be the case in a soccer stadium where one could not possibly perhaps imagine as many Jews attending this event. The opening of the kosher McDonald's in the Abasto Mall and, right, this 2018 edition, right, of, kosher becoming mainstream is indicative of the growth of an increasingly more observant Jewish population. I mentioned in the past, right, that Argentine Jews in Argentina had created a mostly secular type of culture. And this seems to be changing. While it is hard to provide definite numbers given the lack of updated studies in this area, Orthodoxy has been on the rise since the 1940s, but picked up steam in the 1970s. In 2005, a study suggested that between 8 and 10% of the population of Buenos Aires could be defined as Orthodox. Buenos Aires, not the rest of the country. It's harder to be kosher in the rest of a country so far away from some of the centers. Now, of course, the Orthodox world is quite diverse, with Sephardi groups, Ashkenazi collectives, transnational groups, which started to grow with the arrival in the mid-1950s of emissaries from Chabad Lubavitch and from the Satmar Hasidic community. And all these groups have been growing, in part because of the large numbers of children born of very observant families and the creation of Orthodox educational and religious institutions to sustain such growth in population, and as one of the responses to the decline of synagogues as central institutions of Jewish life. These groups, however, at the very beginning were not very large and not highly visible outside their communal institutions. Chabad was perhaps, right, with a very open outreach agenda, was perhaps the most visible in the streets of Jewish neighborhoods. But starting in the 2000s, religious Jews have now challenged secular Jews for the leadership of the AMIA, which is the main Jewish community organization, reaching the presidency for the first time in 2008. Visible kosher options then appear as another indication of important changes that the Jewish community in Argentina is undergoing. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to paste here a bibliography that I put together with some English resources on Jews in Argentina, if you are interested. And now I think we're going to open the floor up for discussions and questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Brodsky. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think based on the questions that we're already seeing come in, everyone is also finding it just as interesting as I did. So I think the one fairly solid question that I'm not sure you quite answered, but perhaps there's a good reason for it, is how many Jews currently live in Argentina today?
This is a very hard question because census returns don't ask for religion. And so it is very hard unless Jewish institutions take it upon themselves to carry out internal censuses. But one of the things that, given the fact that, as I mentioned, a lot of the Jews in Argentina tend to be secular, many are not associated with Jewish institutions. And so even if those internal censuses are carried out, it is hard, right, to assume that that is a number that will give us a very concrete and clear picture. So people talk about 250,000 Jews, coming down from maybe 340,000 Jews a few decades before. The Jewish community is not immune to economic difficulties in the country, and a lot of the Jews that have left the country have done so due to these economic hard times. And so I would say between 200, 250, Professor de la Pergola from the University of Hebrew University of Jerusalem is the one that does, sort of follows this issue very closely.
Thank you. I guess I wonder if I add the follow-up question to that occurs to me. Do you have a sense of recognizing, I don't know the population of Argentina, what does that work out percentage-wise? Is that comparable to Jewish population in the US today?
So the city of Buenos Aires in itself is said to be the fifth largest, the fifth city with the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. And so that is, it gives you a sense that Argentina is quite within the top five, but, much smaller, right, than the numbers of, like New York or Los Angeles or even Paris, right? So, but there is a visible, sizable, Jewish community, in particular in Buenos Aires, which also in the last few decades, it has concentrated a lot of the Jewish population. People have left the provinces also because of economic issues.
Right, thank you. So then perhaps another one about the community today. Somebody's asked about the current rate of intermarriage among the Jewish community of Argentina. Is that something you can speak to?
Yes, I think that it is something that's been happening. I think that there's been a study of intermarriages done by the American Committee, and they've carried out an interesting survey in which they interviewed people in intermarriages. And one of the things that I think emerged from that is that in many cases, even if Jews are marrying non-Jews, there is a desire to maintain and to keep these Jewish traditions and a sense of Jewish belonging. So it is happening, but it might not be with the results that we kind of presume that intermarriage will have.
Thank you. So we've got a couple questions here I'm going to try and pull together, I think. So people have been asking a little bit about the reasoning behind the reduction in the Jewish population. And one person specifically asked whether Aliyah has had an impact upon the community. So I wonder if I can sort of put those pieces together and ask, is that what's happening, or is it something else, or a variety?
Yeah, thank you. So I do know of both Sebastian Clor, whose work I included in that list, who is actually focused on the Aliyah, right? Sort of a desire by Jews to go and live in Israel. And rather than it being, as one would imagine, inspired by a Zionist desire to return to the motherland, the largest percentages of Jews who left Argentina for Israel did so at the time of hard economic times. And so this notion that we have that Jews left because they were imbued with a Zionist feeling needs to be taken with a little bit of salt, because in many cases Jews are leaving, and in most cases Jews are leaving because of economic hard times. And so in a sense, they're behaving like any other people considering to leave Argentina, seeking better economic opportunities. And I think that also applies to to other to Jews, Argentine Jews that left Argentina, not for Israel, but for other places like the United States, and in some cases to other parts in Latin America.
Thank you. So I'm seeing we're going to run out of time quickly. I kind of want to follow up on that, but let me ask a slightly different question. So going much further back, there's a couple of questions about the Converso community? And is that a community that went to Argentina? And is that a community that is still present, I suppose, within the community?
Yeah. So I did begin my presentation, with the creation of Argentina as a sort of a state of not as a colony of Spain, and we know, right, that Spain and Portugal both did not allow anybody who was not Christian to come to the Americas. Those who did come, right, came as Christians, and therefore they were called crypto-Jews, or Jews who kept their Jewish identity and Jewish connections, away from the eyes of the Inquisition. Those who did come tended to come to places that where it was worth risking your life. And so they went to places like Lima and to Mexico, which were very important colonial centers. Buenos Aires was not anywhere close, right, to the economic activity than what we could see from Lima and from Buenos Aires and from Mexico. And so really there was, you would not risk your life, to come to Buenos Aires. And so there is no sense of crypto-Jews, of an important crypto-Jewish presence in Argentina because of that reason. So most of Jewish life is modern Jewish life after the end of colonialism and the beginning of modern Argentina.
Thank you. I want to ask you, I think I want to go with this one next. So Joe has said some of us have family connections in Argentina. Do you know of genealogy resources for those researching Jewish Argentinian family history?
So I once worked very closely with Paul Armoni, who is the founder of the Jewish Genealogy Association in Argentina. And he did a fantastic job digitizing a lot of the records of deaths, of cemeteries. Now, I do know that even though those were held by the Argentine Association, they were all given over to the local genealogy, to the American Society. And so those are actually searchable through the records that they had been able to gather were given over to that database that now is the database that has most of the Jewish genealogy information. They did publish Toldot, which was, and I'll write it here, and so you could check whether your local university library has copies of those magazines, which were of course in Spanish though.
Thank you, that's wonderful. I think the next question to go to came from Janice, who's asked about the problems of anti-Semitism in Argentina, and specifically the bombings that have taken place in Buenos Aires. Is that something you can talk to a little for us, please?
Yes, I think that the two bombings, the first one, the bombing of the Israeli embassy, and then the bombing of the Jewish community center. It has been argued, right, that these are transnational events made, brought to Buenos Aires or Argentina because Argentina had a system, manned, and I'm using the non-inclusive term, but because most of them were men, manned by individuals that could be bribed, and therefore security was so bad that events like that could actually take place. And so, more than it actually being a concrete assault on the Argentine Jews, it was transnational circumstances that and transnational groups that chose Argentina because of its weak security forces. I grew up in Argentina. I did all my schooling from kindergarten all the way to university in the state system. I never felt anti-Semitism, and I know that individual circumstances sometimes vary, and there will be others who will say, well, I experienced that I think that overall, the government, Argentine government, never really sponsored state anti-Semitism. There are groups that are anti-Semitic, and those we cannot avoid. But as a country, Argentina was very welcoming and, defended the Jews when it was time to defend them.
Thank you. I'm going to go to, I think, a fairly specific question that has come in from someone. Someone is wondering if you could talk about the Jewish communities in Mendoza. I think it's where their son-in-law came from. Is that something you can tell us a little more about, please?
So I can tell you a little bit about the Sephardim, because that's what I studied the most. And so there were Moroccan groups over there. There were also groups from the former Ottoman Empire. And there was a significant, Ashkenazi population there as well. I have to say that life outside of Buenos Aires, Jewish life outside of Buenos Aires, has not been researched, apart from studies that are done by the communities themselves in these provincial levels, or these provincial centers. And so I think Argentina needs people to do this job so that we can learn a lot more. But in my book, and I did include a reference to that, you can find a little bit of information about the Sephardic community in Mendoza, not of all the Jews in Mendoza.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to just do one last question that I just spotted. What was the effect of the immigration of Nazis after World War II on the Jewish community?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As I'm sure people have heard, a lot of former Nazis were allowed entry, or immigration officers just turned a blind eye to their entry into the country. And some people have talked about connections between members of the Peronist government and these Nazi officials. There were some enclaves of Nazis in the cities of Córdoba, there were the Jewish community during those years attempted to address the issue of reparations and complained, but there were and they supported, one knows, right, the capture of some of these Nazis in Argentina. There is ways that we know that the Argentine Jewish community collaborated in the capture of Eichmann. It also was, it placed many of the Jews in a bind, because they did not want to be seen as allowing, right, the loss of Argentine sovereignty in permitting, right, to have the Mossad come in and take Eichmann in the middle of the night without permission from the government, because in a sense the Jews were then, attacked, because of, this dual loyalty that they were exposed to. It's a very interesting topic. Professor Ryan has written on Eichmann and the capture and some of the ramifications of that event.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's fascinating. So I'd like to say thank you all for joining us this afternoon, especially Dr. Brodsky, Roberta, who we heard from at the beginning, and Laura, who's been running tech for us. Please consider using the links that are now popping up in chat, where you can enjoy a recording of one of the previous presentations within this series, which explores global Jewish life, or you can register for one of our upcoming programs that you heard about during the opening. As a reminder, the next program will be the same time, same place, next Thursday, where we'll be learning about the Jewish community of Turkey. As you leave, also remember, find Dr. Brodsky's link in there as well for that further reading as well. We'll stick around for a minute to make sure everyone has time to grab the links they would like. As you leave the presentation today, please take a moment to fill out the survey that you'll be directed towards. It really does help us in our planning. And then with that, I would just like to say thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.